The drive to the estate had been a miserable exercise in endurance. Rain lashed against the windshield of my car, blurring the sprawling, manicured lawns of the Orange County neighborhood where I grew up. Every massive gate I passed was a monument to excess, and none more so than the wrought iron monstrosity guarding my father's property. Walking through those heavy front doors earlier this evening felt like stepping into a mausoleum dedicated to Callahan's towering ego. The marble floors gleamed under the light of imported crystal chandeliers, and the air was thick with the scent of roasted meats, heavy perfumes, and old money. I had spent the first hour of the evening standing near a massive bay window, silently observing the crowd of relatives and business associates. They all wore their wealth like armor. Tailored suits, designer gowns, and forced smiles masking a deep, underlying rot. When the dinner bell finally rang, signaling the start of the main course, I felt a familiar knot tighten in my stomach. I walked toward the massive mahogany dining table, which was easily long enough to seat 25 people. The table was set with fine china, polished silverware, and delicate crystal glasses that caught the light in sparkling flashes. I found my assigned seat near the far end, far away from the head of the table where Callahan presided like a feudal lord. I reached out, my fingers just grazing the pale, cream-colored velvet fabric of the dining chair. I was ready to sit down, eat my meal in silence, and get this dreadful evening over with. Out of nowhere, a heavy splash of dark red liquid slammed into the seat. The expensive burgundy wine soaked into the delicate velvet instantly, spreading outward like a fresh, gaping wound on the pristine fabric. The deep red stain darkened, ruining the chair beyond repair. I froze, my hand still hovering inches above the ruined velvet. The cheerful, arrogant chatter of the extended family members died in less than a second. The sudden silence was so heavy it felt suffocating, pressing against my eardrums. I could hear the rain hitting the tall glass windows and the faint ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway. I slowly looked up. My father, Callahan, stood towering over me. He had moved from his place at the head of the table with surprising speed. The empty crystal wine glass dangled loosely from his thick, heavy fingers. His face was twisted into that familiar, ugly sneer, the exact same look of pure disgust I had spent years trying to process in therapy. His eyes, cold and dark, bore into mine with a predatory intensity. He took a deep breath, puffing out his chest under his bespoke suit, ensuring that every single person in the room was watching him. "I do not eat with a worthless disgrace," Callahan boomed, his voice echoing through the sudden quiet of the lavish dining room. The words hit me right in the chest, sharp and breathless. A hot, burning wave of pure anger flared up in my throat, threatening to choke me. This was the man who was supposed to protect me, the man who was supposed to be my father. Yet here he was, publicly humiliating me just for the entertainment of a room full of shallow relatives who fed on drama like vultures. He wanted to break me. He wanted to assert his dominance in front of his sycophants. For a fraction of a second, I felt like that terrified 18-year-old girl again, standing in the freezing snow, shivering and entirely alone. From the other end of the table, my younger sister, Fallon, let out a loud, mocking giggle. She leaned over to Aunt Rowena, whispering something behind her hand, her eyes dancing with malicious joy. The sound of her laughter echoed off the marble walls, sharp and cruel, breaking the tension for the rest of the guests. A few uncles chuckled nervously. Someone cleared their throat. They all expected me to shatter. They expected tears to well up in my eyes, blurring my vision. They expected me to stammer out a pathetic apology, turn around, and make a quiet, shameful exit out the back door, just like I always did when I was younger. They wanted a victim. But the woman standing in front of them tonight was not the broken teenager they had thrown away. I did not flinch. I did not cry. I did not give them the satisfaction of seeing me bleed. I calmly pulled a heavy linen napkin from the table, slowly wiped a stray drop of dark wine from my wrist, and looked right back into my father's cold eyes. I held his gaze, refusing to look away, refusing to shrink. "You just made a $100 million mistake," I said. My voice was dangerously steady, devoid of any emotion, cutting through the silence like a scalpel. Callahan smirked, letting out a short, dismissive snort. He tossed the empty crystal glass onto the table, the fragile crystal clinking loudly against a silver platter. He clearly dismissed my words as the empty threat of a delusional failure. To him, I was just Sloane, the family disappointment. He thought I was still working entry-level jobs, struggling to pay rent in a tiny apartment on the wrong side of town. He assumed my tailored charcoal suit was either rented or bought on a maxed-out credit card. He had no idea who I really was now. He had no idea that I was a turnaround strategist for one of the most ruthless private equity firms on the West Coast. My entire career was built on dismantling failing companies, liquidating their assets, and tearing down arrogant CEOs just like him. The guests shifted uncomfortably in their seats, exchanging quiet, mocking whispers. The staff, wearing crisp white uniforms, scurried around the edges of the room, pretending not to see the massive stain on the chair or the tension radiating across the room. I stood there, feeling the damp chill of the wine that had splashed onto my cuff, grounding myself in the reality of the moment. I had prepared for this. I had spent 6 grueling months tracing every hidden bank account, every offshore shell company, and every illegal loan my father had taken out to keep this illusion of immense wealth alive. He loved to project power. He loved the smell of expensive cigars, the feel of Italian leather, and the blind obedience of the people around him. But I knew the truth. His construction and real estate empire was crumbling from the inside out, hollowed by years of reckless greed and terrible investments. He was a fraud, wrapped in expensive fabric. When he turned his back to me, acting as if I had already vanished from his world, I felt a slight vibration in my tailored blazer pocket. I slipped my phone out, keeping it low out of sight behind the edge of the table. The screen lit up with a secure text message from Hayes, the senior attorney representing my firm's interests. The message was short, brutal, and beautiful. The debt is locked. The countdown begins. I stared at the glowing words, a cold sense of calm washing over my entire body. The anger that had spiked in my chest settled into a freezing, calculated focus. Callahan was busy pouring himself another glass of wine, laughing loudly at a joke someone made at the other end of the table. He thought he was the king of the castle. He thought he held all the cards. When he turned back around to smile triumphantly at his guests, I gently wiped the last trace of spilled wine from my hand. He had no idea that the very ground beneath his expensive leather shoes was already gone. He did not know that the spilled wine was just the final drop for a mistake worth $100 million. Standing in the shadows of that dining room, surrounded by the overwhelming smell of roasted lamb, garlic, and expensive perfumes, my mind began to pull me backward in time. The laughter echoing off the high ceilings morphed into the harsh, biting wind of a January night 14 years ago. The principle of contrast is a funny thing. The warmer and wealthier this room felt, the colder my memories became. I needed these memories right now. I needed to walk through the museum of my own pain to remind myself exactly why I was standing here, holding the trigger to a financial bomb. I was 18 years old. I remember the exact texture of the thin, cheap polyester coat I was wearing when Callahan dragged me by my arm toward the massive oak front doors of this very house. The floor had felt like ice beneath my bare feet. I had just received an acceptance letter to a state university with a partial scholarship for finance. I had proudly shown it to him, thinking, in my naive teenage mind, that he might actually be proud of me. Instead, he had flown into a rage. I had told him I wanted to study finance instead of skipping college to work as his personal secretary for minimum wage. In his eyes, independence was rebellion, and rebellion was a disease he needed to cure immediately. He threw my canvas duffel bag out into the snow. The cheap plastic zipper broke on impact, spilling my few belongings, a couple of sweaters, some worn-out jeans, and my favorite worn paperback books, onto the slushy, freezing driveway. "If you walk out that door, you are dead to this family," he had roared, his face red with fury, veins popping on his thick neck. "You are a stubborn, ungrateful little brat who will never amount to anything without my money. You are going to fail, Sloane. And when you are starving in the gutter, do not dare crawl back here begging for scraps." He slammed the door so hard the glass panes rattled in their wooden frames. I stood in the freezing snow for 3 hours, gathering my clothes with numb, bleeding fingers, stuffing them back into the broken bag. That night, I did not just leave a house. I left behind any hope of ever having a father. I walked 4 miles in the sleet to a 24-hour diner, ordered a coffee I could barely afford, and sat in a booth until the sun came up. I survived the next few years on ramen noodles, worked 3 grueling shifts as a waitress, and took on crippling student loans just to keep a roof over my head. Not once did Callahan call. Not once did anyone in this house check to see if I had frozen to death. Then came my 21st birthday. I was drowning in final exams, working 80-hour weeks between my classes and my jobs. I was exhausted to my very bones, living in a studio apartment that smelled permanently of damp mold. A thick, creamy envelope arrived in my rusted metal mailbox. It had the elegant, sweeping handwriting of my mother, Blythe. For a brief, stupid second, a spark of foolish hope flared in my chest. Maybe she missed me. Maybe she wanted to check if I was still alive, to send a small token of affection. I carefully tore open the envelope, my hands shaking slightly. Inside was a beautiful, heavy-stock birthday card embossed with gold foil. But there was no letter. There was no "I love you, please come home." There was just a folded, yellowing receipt. It was the dental bill for my childhood braces, accompanied by a small, yellow sticky note in her immaculate handwriting. "Since you are an adult now, it is time you pay us back for this. Check or wire transfer is fine." I had stared at that note until my vision blurred, the sheer cruelty of it suffocating the last tiny bit of love I held for her. She had weaponized my own birthday to remind me that I was nothing more than a financial burden they were glad to be rid of. But the real scar, the one that truly defined the word family for me, happened 2 years later. Fallon was 20, reckless, and practically vibrating with the arrogant invincibility of a child who had never faced a single consequence in her entire life. She had taken Callahan's vintage Mercedes out after a night of heavy drinking at an exclusive country club party. She ran a red light at 70 miles an hour and smashed the car into a city utility pole, totaling the priceless vehicle and nearly killing herself in the process. I was studying in the quiet section of the university library when Callahan called me from an unknown number. It was the first time I had heard his harsh voice in years. He didn't ask how I was doing. He demanded I come to the downtown police station immediately. When I arrived, the air smelled of stale coffee, sweat, and despair. Callahan cornered me in a dim, peeling hallway before the police could even speak to me. He grabbed my shoulders, his grip tight enough to leave dark bruises on my skin for weeks. "Fallon has a bright future," he hissed, his eyes wild, darting around the hallway. "She is about to get engaged to the son of a state senator. A DUI will ruin her life. You have nothing to lose, Sloan. You are already a nobody. Tell the police you were driving. You owe us for raising you. Do this, and I will pay off your pathetic student loans." I refused. I stood my ground, terrified, my knees shaking, but firm. I refused to take the fall for a crime I did not commit. The look of pure, venomous hatred that crossed his face in that moment was etched into my brain forever. He looked at me not as a daughter, but as a disgusting insect that had refused to be squashed. He had to pay an astronomical sum in bribes, high-priced lawyers, and donations to keep Fallon out of jail and sweep the incident under the rug. From that day on, I was not just a disappointment. I was an enemy. I was the villain in their twisted family narrative. Fallon walked away without a single scratch, wearing her victimhood like a designer accessory, while I carried the heavy, invisible burden of their hatred. The sudden clinking of silverware brought me violently back to the present. I blinked, the opulent dining room snapping back into focus. The warm light, the smell of wine, the sound of polite conversation. They were all sitting there, cutting into their perfectly cooked steaks, believing they were untouchable kings and queens of their little world. They thought I had returned to this house today with my tail tucked between my legs. They thought I was finally desperate enough to endure their abuse. But they forgot a fundamental truth. You should never corner a wounded animal, especially when that animal has learned how to build an entire empire from the very stones you threw at her. I took a slow, deep breath, letting the anger settle into a cold, calculated focus. The dinner party carried on as if the ugly incident with the spilled wine was nothing more than a brief piece of theater, a mild entertainment before the main course. I moved away from the ruined chair, navigating around the edge of the room, and stood near the massive stone fireplace. I watched the spectacle unfold, studying them like a hawk watching a field of oblivious mice. Aunt Rowena spotted me almost immediately. She altered her path, zeroing in on me like a heat-seeking missile. She was dripping in gaudy gold jewelry that clanked loudly together with every heavy step she took. Her perfume smelled like rotting roses and pure condescension, a scent that always made my stomach turn. She stopped a few feet away, plastering a fake, pitying smile across her heavily powdered face. "Well, Sloane," she started, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. She looked me up and down, her eyes lingering critically on my tailored charcoal suit. "I must say, I am quite surprised you showed your face tonight after all these years. Your mother told me you were still struggling in the city, living paycheck to paycheck. Tell me, dear, did you have to take out another dreadful little loan to afford that outfit? Or are you involved in something shadowy?" She let the word hang in the air, a nasty accusation wrapped in a polite, high society smile. The flying monkeys like Rowena always did Callahan's dirty work, spreading rumors and whispering lies to ensure my reputation remained thoroughly tarnished in the eyes of the extended family. I offered her a tight, polite smile, refusing to take the bait. "The suit is fully paid for, Aunt Rowena. I find that honest, hard work pays quite well. You should suggest that concept to your son sometime. I heard his third tech startup went bankrupt last month, and he had to move back into your basement." Rowena's face flushed a deep, ugly red, the powder on her cheeks failing to hide the sudden burst of color. She opened her mouth, sputtering for a comeback, but her mind was too slow. She quickly turned on her heel and stomped away, her gold bracelets clanking angrily. I watched her go, feeling a tiny spark of grim satisfaction. Across the room, Fallon was holding court, surrounded by a group of fawning cousins. She was wearing a stunning, absurdly expensive diamond necklace that caught the light every time she tossed her hair. She was speaking loudly, making sure everyone within a 20-foot radius could hear about her latest so-called accomplishments. "It is just so exhausting," Fallon sighed dramatically, sipping her vintage champagne. "Being the director of lifestyle and philanthropy for the company takes such a toll on my mental health. But the charity gala we hosted for the Ocean Conservation Fund last weekend was simply magical. We raised almost $10,000 for the sea turtles." I almost laughed out loud, but forced my face to remain impassive. I knew the exact financial breakdown of that specific gala. It was detailed meticulously in the files sitting on my desk back at the firm. Bennett Construction had spent nearly $200,000 on catering, imported ice sculptures, and private musical entertainment for that single event, all to raise a pathetic $10,000 for charity. It was not a philanthropic endeavor, it was a massive, tax-deductible vanity project funded by a company drowning in toxic debt. It was designed entirely to give Fallon a reason to wear new designer gowns, take photos for social media, and pretend she worked for a living. I felt a sudden presence beside me. Uncle Declan stood there, holding out a crystal glass filled with ice water. He was Callahan's younger brother, a self-made restaurant owner who always looked entirely out of place in this mansion. His hands were calloused from years of working in a kitchen, and his suit, though nice, was clearly bought off the rack, lacking the bespoke tailoring everyone else wore. He was the only person in this family who actually understood the value of $1, and the only one who had ever shown me a shred of decency. I took the glass, nodding my thanks, enjoying the cold condensation against my palm. "He is in rare form tonight," Declan muttered, not looking at me directly. He kept his eyes fixed on his brother at the head of the table. The wine trick was low, even for him. "You shouldn't have to put up with that garbage, Sloane." "He is desperate, Declan," I said softly, taking a sip of the cold water. "Desperation makes people ugly. He knows the walls are closing in." Declan let out a low, rough chuckle. When I was 19 and desperately trying to get my first student loan to cover tuition, the bank required a cosigner because my credit history was non-existent. Callahan had refused, laughing in my face and telling me to get a job at a gas station. It was Declan who had secretly met me at a diner late one night, signed the heavy stack of paperwork, and told me to make him proud. I paid that loan off 5 years ago, working triple shifts to ensure he never carried my burden, but I never forgot the lifeline he threw me when I was drowning. "You look sharp, kid," Declan said quietly, a genuine smile touching the corners of his eyes. He shot me a subtle, knowing wink that sent a jolt of anticipation straight to my core. "Just remember to aim for the head when you take your shot." He patted my shoulder gently and walked away before anyone could notice our interaction. I stood by the fireplace, the ice water cooling my dry throat. The tension in the room was thick enough to cut with a knife. They were all dancing on the deck of a sinking ship, cheering for the captain while the freezing water rushed in below them. Have you ever had to bite your lips so hard it almost bleeds, just to stop yourself from screaming in a room full of blood relatives who treat you like garbage? If you have ever felt that kind of isolation, drop a like and subscribe to the channel. Let me know in the comments what you would do if you were in my shoes. Because what I am about to do next is going to leave this entire room of supposed elite society utterly speechless. The noise of the dining room became suffocating. The constant clinking of heavy silver forks against fine china, the loud, boastful laughter of men pretending to be richer than they were, the smell of roasted meat mixing with heavy, expensive perfumes all twisted together into a sensory overload that made my head pound. I needed a moment of silence to ground myself, to mentally prepare for the final strike. I slipped away from the fireplace, navigating the long, familiar hallway toward the west wing of the mansion. The walls were lined with large oil paintings and framed photographs of the family, Fallon's graduations, Callahan's award ceremonies, Blythe's country club events. Not a single picture of me existed in this house. I was a ghost haunting my own childhood home. I headed for Callahan's private study, intending to grab a box of tissues from his desk to properly dry the lingering dampness on my blazer sleeve. The study was a shrine to his enormous ego. Dark mahogany walls, towering bookshelves filled with leather-bound books he had never actually read, and the heavy, lingering scent of expensive Cuban cigars and old leather. It was dim, illuminated only by a single brass reading lamp, and blissfully quiet. But as I stepped further inside, the heavy oak door closing silently on its oiled hinges behind me, I heard a voice drifting in through the partially open French doors leading out to the stone balcony. It was Callahan. He was on his cell phone, pacing back and forth in the cold night air. His voice was hushed, but laced with an undeniable, frantic panic. I froze instantly, my instincts taking over. I pressed my back against the wall, hiding perfectly in the deep shadows of the heavy velvet curtains framing the doors. "I do not care how long he has been here," Callahan hissed into the phone, his voice dripping with venom. "I told you to fire him yesterday. Nolan is making too much money, and we need to trim the fat before the auditors look too closely at the payroll. Offer him a 2-week severance if he promises not to sue, and get him off the property by tomorrow morning." My stomach churned violently. Nolan was the elderly security guard who had worked at the front gate for 20 years. He was a sweet, quiet man who had always sneaked me extra cookies from the kitchen when I was a kid. His wife was currently battling severe illness, and he relied heavily on the company's health insurance to keep her alive. Firing him abruptly, without a pension or proper notice, was not just a harsh business decision, it was a death sentence for his family. And Callahan was doing it just to save a few $1,000s, likely to offset the cost of the brand new Porsche he had bought Fallon last month. It was an act of pure, calculated cruelty. But it was the next sentence out of his mouth that made my blood freeze solid in my veins. "Look, the bridging loan needs to be approved by tomorrow afternoon, or the payroll checks will bounce," Callahan said, his voice trembling slightly with a desperate urgency I had never heard from him before. "I gave you the social security number." "Yes, it is my daughter's. Sloan Bennett. Her credit score is pristine. She works in corporate finance. The shadow lenders will love her financial profile." No, she does not know she is a cosigner. And she is not going to find out. Just forge the signature on the digital documents like I paid you to do. Use the notary stamp we bought. If this company goes under, I am not going down alone. Let the bank chase her for the default. I stopped breathing. The air in the study suddenly felt incredibly thin, as if a vacuum had sucked all the oxygen out of the room. The sheer magnitude of the betrayal hit me like a physical blow to the ribs, knocking the wind out of me. He was not just a terrible father, he was an active predator. He had stolen my social security number, likely digging through old tax records stored in this very room, to illegally list me as a guarantor for a massive, high-interest shadow loan. He was trying to use my decade of grueling hard work, my flawless credit history, and my spotless professional reputation to temporarily plug the gaping holes in his sinking ship. If his company collapsed, and I knew for an absolute fact it was going to within hours, the creditors would come directly after me. They would seize my personal assets, destroy my career at the firm, and leave me drowning in millions of dollars of debt that I never agreed to. He was willingly, knowingly sacrificing my entire life, my entire future, just to buy himself a few more months of pretending to be a billionaire. I backed away from the balcony doors, my footsteps completely silent on the thick Persian rug. I walked over to his massive oak desk, resting my hands on the cool wood to steady myself. My reflection stared back at me from the polished surface. My hands were shaking, not from fear, but from a rage so profound, so deep, it felt like magma burning in my chest. A cold realization washed over me, clearing away any lingering doubts. I had worried, in the quiet, lonely hours of the night, if I was being too ruthless. I had wondered if destroying his legacy made me just as bad as him. But hearing him plot to ruin my future without a second thought erased every single ounce of guilt I possessed. He wanted to sacrifice me again. He wanted to offer me up on the altar of his own ego. The chill running down my spine was no longer driven by shock. It was driven by the cold, hard logic of warfare. He wanted to play dirty. He wanted to use my name to save his dying empire. But he had fundamentally miscalculated the situation. I pulled my phone out again and looked at the glowing message from Hayes. The trap was set. The steel jaws were ready to snap shut. My father thought he was the cunning hunter, setting a snare for his clueless, estranged daughter. But he didn't realize he had just stepped blindly into a minefield that I had spent the last 6 months carefully burying. He wanted to use my credit? He was about to find out exactly how much financial power I truly possessed. I stood perfectly still in the dim, quiet light of the study, letting the raw anger harden into a sharp, focused weapon. To understand exactly how Callahan had doomed himself, you have to understand the numbers. In the ruthless world of private equity and distressed assets, emotions mean nothing. Numbers are the only things that tell the brutal, unforgiving truth. 6 months ago, a massive, highly disorganized file landed on my desk at the firm. It was a portfolio of severely distressed commercial debt packaged together by a panicked regional bank. They were desperately trying to offload their toxic assets before the end of the fiscal quarter to avoid an audit. As I flipped through the digital pages, scanning the lists of failing enterprises, a familiar company name jumped out at me like a flashing red light: Bennett Construction and Development. I remember the shock that had rippled through my body. I locked my office door, poured another cup of black coffee, and dug deeper. I pulled every financial record, every audit, every tax return, and every property deed associated with the business. The reality of Callahan's empire was staggering, and not in a good way. The company was drowning in exactly $100 million of high-interest, short-term debt. They had leveraged every single property, every piece of heavy machinery, and even the future projected revenue of unbuilt projects just to maintain basic cash flow. They were bleeding money at a catastrophic rate. Fallon's absurdly high salary for doing absolutely nothing, Blythe's country club memberships and luxury vacations billed as corporate expenses, and Callahan's reckless bidding on commercial contracts he could never fulfill had created a massive financial black hole. I had sat in my office late that night, staring at the glowing monitors. I needed solid proof that this was not just a temporary market downturn, but systemic, intentional fraud. That was when a heavy, unmarked manila envelope arrived at my apartment via private courier. Inside were hundreds of pages of internal company ledgers, damning emails regarding bribed inspectors, and hidden bank statements showing money funneled into offshore accounts. There was no return address, but tucked inside the front cover was a small, grease-stained receipt from Uncle Declan's diner. It was his silent signal. Declan had risked everything to leak the internal documents to me, knowing that the company was a fragile house of cards ready to crush the hundreds of innocent employees who worked there. Armed with Declan's irrefutable documents, I went straight to my managing partner. I pitched a hostile debt takeover. I explained the assets, the liabilities, and the exact, ruthless strategy needed to strip the company down and liquidate it for a massive profit. The partners were hesitant at first, but the numbers were too good to ignore. I worked 100 hours a week for 4 solid months. I barely slept. I lived on cold takeout, black coffee, and the burning desire to finally expose the truth. I negotiated with 3 different banks, navigating a complex labyrinth of legal loopholes to consolidate all of Callahan's loans into one massive portfolio. By the end of it, my firm had successfully purchased 80% of Bennett Construction's bad debt for pennies on the dollar. And, because I had orchestrated the entire deal from the ground up, my firm granted me full executive authority over the portfolio. I was the one holding the leash. Callahan had been desperately ignoring the warnings from his previous bank, assuming his usual bullying tactics, golf course handshakes, and political connections would secure him another extension. He had no idea his debt had been sold to a shark. He had no idea that the faceless corporate entity now controlling his destiny was represented by the daughter he had just called a worthless disgrace. I looked at the vintage grandfather clock ticking softly in the corner of the study. It was almost 8 o'clock. I adjusted the collar of my charcoal blazer, smoothed out the fine fabric, and walked out of the study. The hallway felt different now. The mansion no longer felt like an imposing monument to my father's power. It felt like a crime scene waiting for the yellow tape to be put up. I stepped back into the dining room. The dinner had progressed to the dessert course. Thick slices of rich chocolate cake sitting on gold-rimmed plates were being passed around. Callahan was standing at the head of the table again, a fresh glass of expensive wine in his hand, raising it high for a toast. To the future, Callahan declared, his loud voice echoing off the walls, a stark contrast to the panicked whisper I had just heard on the balcony. And to the new commercial zoning contract in the financial district. It is going to be our most profitable year yet. The guests raised their glasses, clapping and cheering loudly. Fallon beamed, her eyes sparkling, already calculating how much of that non-existent profit she could siphon off for a shopping spree in Paris. I stood silently near the grand entryway, watching the pathetic display of fake prosperity. They were cheering for a ghost. I checked my watch. 8 o'clock on the dot. Right on cue, the heavy brass doorbell at the front of the mansion rang. The loud chime echoed sharply, cutting through the laughter and the clinking of dessert forks. The room went still. Callahan frowned deeply, annoyed by the interruption during his moment of glory. He waved a dismissive hand at one of the staff members to go answer the door. I stood perfectly still, my heart beating in a slow, steady, powerful rhythm. The executioner had arrived. The heavy oak front doors groaned open, and the sound of heavy, deliberate footsteps echoed on the marble foyer. The dining room fell completely silent as the staff member stepped back into the room, looking pale and unsure of what to do. Into the warm, golden light of the dining room stepped Hayes. He was a senior partner at the massive law firm that handled all of our corporate litigation, and he looked every bit the part of a ruthless legal shark. He wore a razor-sharp navy blue suit that cost more than most people's cars. His silver hair was perfectly combed, and his expression was as cold and unreadable as a slab of granite. In his right hand, he carried a thick, black leather briefcase that looked heavy enough to contain a bomb. In a very real financial sense, it did. Callahan's annoyed frown deepened into a dark scowl. He did not recognize Hayes, but he instantly recognized the aura of authority the man projected. "Who the hell are you?" Callahan demanded, his voice thick with whine and irritation. He puffed his chest out, trying to dominate the room. "We are in the middle of a private family dinner. How did you get past the security gate?" Hayes did not flinch. He walked slowly toward the massive dining table, his expensive leather shoes clicking sharply against the polished wood floor. He stopped a few feet away from Callahan, placing the heavy briefcase on the edge of the table, right next to a platter of half-eaten chocolate cake. "Good evening, Mr. Bennett," Hayes said, his voice smooth, professional, but completely devoid of any warmth. "My name is Arthur Hayes. I am the senior legal counsel representing your primary creditors. I apologize for the intrusion during your dinner, but your office has ignored our formal communications for the past 72 hours, and this matter required immediate, in-person notification." A low murmur of confusion rippled through the guests. Aunt Rowena exchanged a worried, frantic glance with Blythe, who had suddenly gone very pale, clutching her pearl necklace. Fallon lowered her champagne glass, her fake smile faltering, replaced by a look of sheer confusion. Callahan scoffed loudly, waving his large hand dismissively. He laughed, a harsh, grating sound. "Creditors? You mean the bank. Listen, Hayes, I already spoke to the regional manager last week on the golf course. The debt extension paperwork is supposed to be on its way. Just leave the documents on the table, I will sign them, and you can see yourself out." He reached into his breast pocket, pulling out a heavy gold-plated fountain pen, entirely convinced that his massive financial problems could be solved with a single, arrogant signature. Hayes did not open the briefcase. He looked at Callahan with a mixture of professional detachment and mild pity. "There are no extension documents to sign, Mr. Bennett," Hayes stated clearly, making sure his crisp voice carried to every single corner of the quiet room. "The bank refused your request for a restructuring of the loan. In fact, they flagged your corporate account for severe financial irregularities. Due to your failure to meet the required liquidity covenants, they exercised their legal right to sell your distressed debt portfolio." Callahan's hand froze midair. The gold pen hovered over the table, shaking slightly. The color began to drain rapidly from his face, leaving him looking sickly and suddenly very old. "Sold? What do you mean sold? To who?" "Your debt was acquired 48 hours ago by a private equity firm," Hayes continued relentlessly, his voice slicing through the tension. "And they are not interested in extending your credit. They're calling in the loans. All of them. Immediately." The room erupted into shocked gasps. Blythe put a trembling hand to her chest, her breathing turning shallow and fast. Fallon stared at Hayes, her mouth hanging slightly open in disbelief, the diamond necklace suddenly looking very heavy on her neck. "That is impossible," Callahan roared, slamming his heavy fist onto the table so hard the silverware rattled and a wine glass tipped over. "I have a new commercial contract in the financial district. It is worth $50 million. It guarantees our cash flow for the next 3 years. Call your bosses right now and tell them they are making a massive mistake." Hayes reached into his inside jacket pocket and pulled out a single, folded sheet of thick paper. He slid it across the polished wood table toward Callahan. "I am afraid that contract is no longer valid, Mr. Bennett," Hayes said coldly. "The developers pulled out of the agreement at exactly 5 o'clock this afternoon after conducting a secondary background check on your company's fiscal health. You have zero incoming revenue, and as of this exact moment, you're in default on $100 million of corporate debt." Callahan stared at the piece of paper as if it were a venomous snake preparing to strike. His chest heaved. The illusion of his immense power was shattering in real time, right in front of his family and friends. He looked up at Hayes, his eyes wide with a sudden, feral desperation. "Who?" Callahan demanded, his voice dropping to a harsh, desperate whisper. "Who bought the debt? Give me a name. Give me a phone number. I demand to speak to the person in charge. I can fix this. I can negotiate with them." Hayes slowly adjusted his silver-rimmed glasses. The corner of his mouth twitched upward in the faintest hint of a smile. He did not reach for his phone. He did not open his briefcase to find a business card. Instead, he slowly turned his head and looked directly across the room, past the stunned, pale faces of the guests, past the terrified expression on Fallon's face, and locked eyes with me standing quietly in the shadows by the fireplace. "I do not need to make a phone call, Mr. Bennett," Hayes said, his voice echoing perfectly in the dead silence of the room. "The executive holding the controlling interest in your debt, the person who now holds full authority over the liquidation of your entire company, is standing right over there." Every single head in the dining room snapped in my direction. Thank you so much for watching the story so far. If you are enjoying seeing this toxic family finally face the consequences of their actions, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. You won't want to miss the explosive conclusion. What would you do if you were holding the fate of the people who abused you in your hands? Let me know down in the comments. Every single head in the dining room snapped in my direction. The collective gasp that sucked the air out of the room was a sound I will remember for the rest of my life. Dozens of eyes, previously filled with scorn, pity, or total indifference, were now wide with an unreadable mixture of shock and sheer terror. I stepped out of the shadows cast by the grand stone fireplace, my low block heels clicking in a slow, deliberate rhythm against the polished marble floor. The sound echoed like a judge's gavel in a silent courtroom. For a brief, agonizing second, the reality of the situation hung suspended in the air, too massive for their privileged minds to process. Then, Fallon shattered the silence. She let out a loud, piercing shriek of laughter. She leaned back in her chair, her hand clutching her stomach, acting as though Hayes had just delivered the punchline to the greatest joke ever told. "Oh, this is hilarious," Fallon gasped, wiping a fake tear from her eye. She pointed a manicured finger at me, her diamond bracelet sparkling under the chandelier. "Sloan? You think Sloan bought our debt? My sister cannot even afford a decent zip code, let alone $100 million portfolio. Did you hire this actor, Sloan? Is this your pathetic idea of revenge for the wine spill? Because it is genuinely embarrassing." She looked around the table, desperately searching for validation, expecting the uncles and aunts to join in her mockery. But nobody laughed. Not a single soul. Aunt Rowena was staring at me with her mouth hanging open, her gaudy gold necklaces suddenly still. Uncle Declan was leaning against the far wall, his arms crossed over his chest, a slow, proud smile spreading across his weathered face. Callahan did not laugh either. He stared at me, his face turning an unhealthy shade of grayish-purple. His heavy chest rose and fell in rapid, shallow breaths. He looked back at Hayes, then back at me, his mind racing to find the lie, to find the loophole that would prove this was all a massive misunderstanding. I did not say a word to Fallon. I did not need to. I walked straight past her, ignoring her existence entirely, and stopped right next to Hayes. I reached into the oversized leather tote bag I had left resting against the wall earlier in the evening. I pulled out a thick, heavy manila folder. Across the front, stamped in bold red ink, was the logo of the most feared private equity firm on the West Coast, alongside the words, "Bennett Construction, Liquidation Authorization." I tossed the heavy folder onto the dining table. It landed with a loud, definitive smack right next to Callahan's spilled wine glass. "Open it," I said. My voice was calm, steady, and devoid of the rage that had been boiling inside me just an hour ago. The fire had turned to ice. "Read the signature on the final page, Callahan." He hesitated. His thick fingers trembled as he reached out, gingerly pulling the folder toward him. He flipped it open. The pages inside were not fake. They were certified, legally binding documents transferring the entirety of his corporate debt, his collateral, and his entire future into the hands of my firm. And at the bottom of the executive summary, signed in crisp black ink, was my name. Sloan Bennett. Lead restructuring executive. I watched the last shred of his arrogant delusion die right there in front of me. The color fully drained from his face. His knees visibly buckled, and he had to grab the edge of the heavy mahogany table just to keep himself standing. He looked up at me, his dark eyes filled with a raw, naked fear that I had never seen before. The tyrant who had thrown me out into the snow, the man who had called me a worthless disgrace just an hour ago, was now looking at me as if I were a god holding a thunderbolt aimed directly at his head. "You," Callahan choked out, his voice a hoarse whisper. "You're the buyer? You orchestrated this?" "I did not just orchestrate it," I replied, leaning slightly forward, resting my knuckles on the table. "I hunted it. I spent 6 months tracking every single terrible decision you made. I tracked the fraudulent loans, the inflated appraisals, the bribes you paid to city inspectors. I compiled it all, presented it to my board, and convinced them that your empire was nothing more than a rotting carcass waiting to be picked clean. And they gave me the knife." The room erupted into total chaos. Aunts and uncles began shouting, demanding answers, asking what this meant for their investments, their trust funds, their guaranteed summer vacations. Blythe was hyperventilating, fanning herself with a linen napkin, crying out for someone to get her a glass of water. I stood in the center of the storm, feeling a strange, hollow sense of peace. The museum of my pain was finally burning down. Have you ever felt your heart racing out of your chest right before you stand up to a bully? That is exactly how I felt in this moment. If you are thrilled to see the tables turn, please remember to hit that subscribe button and leave a like. Let us dive into the actual numbers that destroyed this fake empire. The chaotic shouting in the dining room swelled to a deafening volume. Relatives who had spent the last decade ignoring me were now screaming my name, begging for explanations, demanding that I fix whatever financial apocalypse had just landed on their dinner table. I stood tall, letting the noise wash over me, refusing to break my calm exterior. I held up a single hand. The gesture was small, but it carried the weight of $100 million. Instantly, the shouting died down to nervous, frantic murmurs. Power is a fascinating thing. They did not respect me as a person, but they were terrified of the authority I now held over their bank accounts. "Let us talk about the math, shall we?" I said, my voice echoing clearly in the sudden quiet. I picked up the folder, flipping to the second page. Bennett Construction is currently holding $100 million in toxic, short-term debt. The interest alone is bleeding the operational budget dry. You have not turned a legitimate profit in 4 years. The only reason you have stayed afloat this long is by illegally shuffling funds between shell companies and taking out shadow loans. I looked directly at Callahan, who was sweating profusely, his expensive suit suddenly looking 3 sizes too big. "You tried to use my social security number today to secure a bridging loan, hoping I would take the fall when you inevitably went bankrupt. Did you really think I would not find out?" A collective gasp swept through the room. Aunt Rowena covered her mouth. Uncle Declan shook his head in disgust. Even in this family of vipers, identity theft against your own child was a bridge too far. "But the debt is not even the most interesting part," I continued, turning my gaze away from my father and locking eyes with my sister. Fallon was sitting rigid in her chair, the smug, arrogant smile entirely wiped from her face. She looked like a cornered animal. "Let us talk about the Director of Lifestyle and Philanthropy," I said, the title tasting like ash in my mouth. I pulled a separate, thinner stack of papers from the back of the folder. While reviewing the company ledgers, my forensic accounting team found a massive discrepancy in the employee pension fund. Specifically, the fund designated for the union laborers who actually break their backs pouring concrete for this company. Callahan frowned, confusion momentarily cutting through his panic. "The pension fund? What are you talking about? That money is locked in a high-yield trust." I corrected him sharply. "Until your beloved golden child gained administrative access to the accounts 18 months ago." I slammed the new stack of papers onto the table, sliding them forcefully toward Callahan. "Over the past year and a half, Fallon has systematically embezzled $1,500,000 from the retirement savings of your own employees," I announced, making sure every syllable hit like a hammer. She disguised the transfers as charitable donations and vendor payments for her ridiculous galas. But the money did not go to save sea turtles. It went to offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands to cover her massive, out-of-control underground gambling debts and her luxury shopping habits. The silence that followed was total. It was as if time itself had stopped. Callahan slowly turned his head to look at Fallon. His eyes were wide, filled with a horrific realization. He had spent his entire life protecting her, covering up her crimes, treating her like royalty while treating me like garbage. And she had been the parasite eating his empire from the inside out. "Fallon," Callahan whispered, his voice cracking. "Tell me she is lying. Tell me right now that this is a lie." Fallon's face was the color of chalk. Her lips trembled. She looked around the room, desperate for an ally, desperate for someone to defend her. But the relatives who had been fawning over her diamond necklace just minutes ago were now staring at her with raw disgust. She was a thief. She had stolen the retirement money of working-class families just to buy designer shoes and pay off bookies. "Daddy, I can explain," Fallon stammered, tears finally welling up in her eyes, real tears this time, born of sheer terror. "I had a bad streak. The people I owed money to, they were threatening me. I only borrowed it. I was going to put it back, I swear. I just needed a little more time to win it back." Blythe let out a sharp, hysterical sob, burying her face in her hands. The golden child had fallen. Her pristine image shattered into a million irreparable pieces. But I was not done. The humiliation of Fallon was just a side dish. The main course was still sitting at the head of the table, clutching his chest as his entire world burned to the ground. And I was about to pour gasoline on the ashes. "There is no putting it back," I stated coldly, looking at my sister's pathetic, crying face. "The money is gone. The auditors have already forwarded the evidence to the federal authorities. You are not just facing bankruptcy, Fallon. You are facing wire fraud and grand larceny." I turned back to Callahan, who looked as though he might have a heart attack right then and there. I had no sympathy left. He had drained it all out of me years ago. It was time to deliver the final blow to his ego. Callahan gripped the edge of the dining table so tightly his knuckles turned stark white. The sheer weight of the revelations was crushing him, pushing him toward a desperate, primal panic. He looked at the legal documents detailing Fallon's embezzlement, then looked back at me, his chest heaving. The arrogant tyrant was gone. In his place was a cornered, terrified old man trying to find a way out of a burning building. He took a shaky step toward me, raising his hands in a gesture that was half surrender, half plea. "Sloan, please," Callahan said, his voice cracking, dripping with a sudden, sickening sweetness that made my stomach turn. "Listen to me. We are family. Blood is thicker than water, right? You have made your point. You are smart. You are brilliant, just like me. You won. But you cannot do this. You cannot liquidate the company. If you pull the plug, hundreds of people lose their jobs. Fallon will go to prison. I will lose everything." He tried to force a smile, a pathetic attempt at charm. "You have the authority to restructure the debt, right? You can authorize an extension. We can fix this. I will fire Fallon. I will put you on the board of directors. You can run the whole operation. Just give us time. Families help each other, Sloan. You cannot destroy your own family." I stared at him, my expression unchanging. Hearing him use the word family as a shield, after spending my entire life using it as a weapon against me, was the most insulting thing he had done all night. "You did not care about family when you threw me out into the snow at 18, I replied, my voice dangerously soft, yet carrying across the silent room. "You did not care about family when you tried to force me to take the fall for Fallon's drunk driving. You did not care about family 2 hours ago when you planned to ruin my credit and my career to save your own skin. Do not dare use that word with me now." Callahan's fake smile vanished, replaced by a desperate anger. "I am still your father. I still demand some level of respect. This is my house. You are standing under my roof." I felt a cold, sharp smile spread across my face. This was the moment. This was the ultimate twist of the knife. "Your roof?" I asked, raising an eyebrow. I reached into the inner pocket of my blazer and pulled out a heavy brass key with a leather tag attached to it. I tossed it onto the table. It slid across the polished wood and stopped right in front of him. "What is this?" Callahan breathed, staring at the key. "That is the master key to this estate," I said clearly. "During my investigation into your finances, I discovered that you had leveraged this mansion to the absolute limit. 3 months ago, you quietly sold the deed to a private holding company to generate emergency cash to cover a margin call, right? You leased the property back so you could maintain the illusion of ownership, pretending you still lived in a house you owned. Blythe gasped loudly, her hand flying to her throat. Callahan? You sold her home? You told me you just refinanced. Callahan ignored her, his eyes locked onto me with pure dread. The holding company that bought this estate, I continued, savoring every single word, is a subsidiary shell corporation. And that corporation is entirely owned and controlled by my private equity firm. Which means Callahan as the lead executive on this portfolio. I paused, letting the silence stretch, letting the horrifying reality sink into his bones. I own the roof over your head. I own the chairs you are sitting on. I own the crystal chandeliers you are so proud of. As of this exact second, you are nothing more than a delinquent tenant living in my property. And your lease has just been terminated. Blythe let out a piercing scream. The heavy crystal wine glass she had been clutching slipped from her trembling fingers and shattered on the marble floor, sending shards of glass and red wine flying across the room. She collapsed back into her chair, weeping hysterically, her perfect makeup running down her face in dark streaks. The guests were frozen in a state of absolute shock. The wealthy, untouchable Bennett family had been reduced to squatters in a matter of minutes. Callahan looked as though he had been physically struck by a train. He staggered backward, hitting the wall, his mouth opening and closing wordlessly. The mansion, his ultimate symbol of status, his fortress of arrogance, belonged to the daughter he had despised. But just as he opened his mouth to scream, to curse me, Hayes took a step forward. The lawyer had remained silent, watching the execution with professional detachment. Now he reached into his jacket pocket. "We are not quite finished, Mr. Bennett," Hayes said smoothly, pulling out a sleek digital audio recorder. "Before Miss Bennett finalizes the liquidation protocol, there is one last piece of evidence that the board of directors required me to present to you. A matter of establishing motive for the immediate acceleration of your debt." Hayes pressed a button on the device. A small green light blinked, and the most devastating secret of all was about to echo through the ruins of my father's empire. The digital recorder in Hayes's hand hummed softly for a fraction of a second before a voice blasted through the dining room. It was Callahan's voice, crisp, arrogant, and dripping with venom. The recording had been captured 3 months ago, but hearing it now, in the middle of this devastation, made it feel incredibly raw. "I do not care what her title is," the recorded voice of Callahan snarled. "Sloan Bennett is a liability. She is mentally unstable, she has a history of theft, and she is actively leaking confidential client data to your competitors. If you do not terminate her employment by the end of the day, I will personally use every connection I have in this city to bury your firm in litigation. Fire her, or I ruin you." The recording clicked off. The echo of the threat faded into the heavy, oppressive silence of the room. I watched the faces of my family. Even the most loyal of the flying monkeys, the aunts and uncles who had spent years defending Callahan's ruthless nature, looked physically repulsed. He had not just ignored me, he had actively hunted me. He had called my managing partner, attempting to destroy my career, my livelihood, and my reputation with vicious lies, simply because the thought of my independence threatened his fragile ego. What Callahan did not know, what he could never have anticipated, was how my firm operated. My managing partner was a ruthless shark who despised being threatened by failing, second-rate local developers. Instead of firing me, my boss had called me into his office, played the recording, and asked me a single question: "Do you want to crush him?" That phone call, that petty, spiteful attempt to ruin my life, was the exact catalyst that triggered the firm to hunt down and acquire his debt. He had literally engineered his own destruction. "You called her boss?" Uncle Declan's voice broke the silence. He stepped forward, his fists clenched tight at his sides. He looked at his brother with an expression of profound, unadulterated disgust. "You tried to destroy her career? Your own flesh and blood? You sick, twisted old man." I was angry. Callahan stammered, his eyes darting around the room, realizing he had lost the support of every single person present. She was disrespecting the family name. I had to teach her a lesson. The only lesson taught here tonight, Hayes interjected smoothly, tucking the recorder back into his jacket, is that actions have legal and financial consequences. Your phone call violated tortious interference laws, adding a layer of personal liability to your corporate default. You handed the firm the exact weapon they needed. The final thread holding the family together snapped violently. The illusion of loyalty, built entirely on money and status, evaporated in an instant. Blythe leaped up from her chair. Her eyes, usually so composed and judgmental, were wild with panic. She lunged across the space, grabbing Fallon by the shoulders of her expensive designer dress. "You stupid, selfish little brat," Blythe screamed, her voice cracking with hysteria. She shook Fallon violently, the diamond necklace scratching against her skin. $1.5 million? You stole from the company? You ruined us. Everything is gone because you couldn't stop playing cards. Get off me!" Fallon shrieked, shoving her mother backward. Blythe stumbled in her high heels, nearly falling into the shattered glass on the floor. Fallon was sobbing, her makeup ruined, looking like a terrified child rather than a wealthy socialite. "It is his fault too. He bought me the cars. He paid off the police. He taught me that rules did not matter." They were turning on each other like starving wolves locked in a cage. The elegant dinner party had devolved into a screaming match of accusations, tears, and ugly, undeniable truths. Aunt Rowena was furiously texting on her phone, undoubtedly warning the rest of the high society circle that the Bennett family was radioactive. The other relatives were quietly edging toward the grand hallway, desperate to escape the blast radius of the sinking ship. Amidst the screaming and the crying, Callahan sank down. His knees gave out, and he collapsed onto the expensive Persian rug. He did not look at his screaming wife. He did not look at his weeping golden child. He looked up at me. The man who had stood over me an hour ago, pouring wine on my chair and calling me a worthless disgrace, was now kneeling on the floor, looking up at the daughter he had thrown away. The shift in power was absolute, undeniable, and permanent. He had built his entire life around the concept of control, and now he had none. He was a king without a kingdom, a tyrant without an army, entirely at the mercy of the person he had hurt the most. I looked down at him. I searched my heart for a spark of pity, a shred of sympathy for the old man crying on the floor. But there was nothing there. The well had run dry a long, long time ago. Callahan reached out, his trembling fingers gripping the hem of my charcoal blazer. The gesture was so pathetic, so entirely devoid of dignity, that I actually felt a brief flash of second-hand embarrassment for him. He was a broken shell of a man, stripped of his money, his power, and his terrifying aura. "Sloan, listen to me," Callahan pleaded, his voice a desperate, wet rasp. Tears were pooling in the deep wrinkles of his face. "I am sorry. I am so sorry for everything. I was wrong. I was a terrible father. I see that now. You are strong. You are the best thing that ever came out of this family. Please, just forgive me. Give me a second chance." I stood perfectly still, letting him grovel. I did not pull my jacket away, but I did not offer him a hand up. "I will do anything," he begged, the panic making his words stumble over each other. "I know we owe you $100 million. I know the company is dead. But we can pay you off. We can settle this privately without the federal authorities getting involved." He scrambled to his feet, swaying slightly, and turned toward Blythe, who was still weeping into her hands. "Blythe," Callahan shouted, his voice finding a brief, desperate strength. "Your inheritance. The villa in Tuscany and the trust fund your grandfather left you. It is worth at least $20 million. We can liquidate it tomorrow. We can sign it all over to Sloan. We can give her the European properties." Blythe's head snapped up. Her tear-streaked face twisted into an expression of pure, unadulterated horror. "My inheritance?" Blythe gasped, stepping away from him as if he were carrying a plague. "That money is in my name alone. It has been in my family for generations. I am not selling my grandfather's estate to pay for your fraudulent debts and your daughter's gambling problems. Are you insane? We have to. Callahan roared, stepping toward her, his face turning red again. It is the only way to keep me out of federal prison. You are my wife. You owe me this. I owe you nothing. Blythe screamed back, her voice echoing off the marble walls. I am filing for divorce the second the courthouse opens tomorrow morning. I am leaving you, Callahan. I will not let you drag me down into the gutter with you. She turned, grabbing her expensive designer coat from a nearby chair, and practically sprinted out of the dining room, her heels clicking frantically toward the front door. The heavy oak doors slammed shut behind her, the sound ringing with a brutal finality. Callahan watched her leave, his jaw hanging open. His own wife, his enabler for 30 years, had thrown him to the wolves the moment the money vanished. He turned back to me, entirely alone now. Even Fallon had shrunk back into the corner, weeping silently, too terrified to speak. Sloan, Callahan whispered, holding his hands out, his eyes wide and hollow. I can find the money. Just give me 30 days. Please. Have mercy. I looked at the man who had tormented me, belittled me, and tried to destroy my future. I thought about the cold winter night he threw me out. I thought about the massive student loans that kept me awake in terror. I thought about the dental bill my mother sent me for my birthday. I thought about the wine soaking into the velvet chair just a few hours ago. I reached down and gently, but firmly, peeled his trembling fingers off the fabric of my blazer. I smoothed the material flat. I told you, I said, my voice as cold and hard as a diamond. I do not eat with a worthless disgrace. And I certainly do not negotiate with one. I turned away from him, looking at Hayes, who was standing quietly with his briefcase. Execute the liquidation protocol, I ordered sharply, stepping into my role as the executive holding the blade. Freeze all corporate accounts immediately. Dispatch the security teams to change the locks on the commercial headquarters. And call the local authorities. I want an eviction notice served on this property by tomorrow afternoon. Hayes nodded once, a crisp, professional acknowledgement. Consider it done, Miss Bennett. The liquidation process has officially commenced. No. Wait. You cannot do this. Callahan screamed, falling back to his knees, burying his face in his hands, his sobs echoing loudly in the ruined dining room. I did not look back at him. I did not gloat. I did not smile. There was no joy in this destruction, only a cold, necessary justice. I picked up my leather tote bag, adjusted the strap on my shoulder, and walked away from the table. I walked past the terrified relatives, past my weeping sister, and headed straight for the grand entrance. My footsteps were steady, leaving the wreckage of the Bennett Empire far behind me. But as my hand touched the cold brass handle of the heavy oak door, a voice called out from behind me, causing me to pause. Sloan. Hold on a second. I turned around. Uncle Declan was walking down the hallway toward me. He had left the dining room chaos behind, his hands stuffed deep into the pockets of his off-the-rack suit. He stopped a few feet away, looking at me with a mixture of awe and deep, genuine affection. I knew you were smart, Declan said softly, a tired but proud smile touching his lips. But I did not know you were a force of nature. You really burned it all down, didn't you? I just let the rot expose itself, Uncle Declan, I replied, feeling the tight coil of tension in my chest finally begin to unwind. They destroyed themselves. I just handed them the bill. Declan nodded slowly. He reached out and placed a warm, calloused hand on my shoulder. It was the only touch of genuine comfort I had received in this house in my entire life. You did good, kid, he said, his voice thick with emotion. You protected a lot of innocent workers today. You stopped him from hurting anyone else. I am proud of you. I have always been proud of you. I felt a sudden tightness in my throat, a sting of real tears that Callahan and his cruelty could never force out of me. I swallowed hard, nodding my thanks. Keep your restaurant running smoothly, Declan. I might need a free burger someday. He laughed, a warm, booming sound that chased away the shadows of the hallway. Anytime, kid. Now go on. Get out of this crypt. I pushed open the heavy front doors and stepped out into the night. The rain had stopped, leaving the air smelling sharp, clean, and incredibly fresh. I walked down the long, sweeping driveway toward my car. The gravel crunched beneath my shoes. For the first time in 32 years, the massive weight of the Bennett family name had completely vanished from my shoulders. The fallout over the next few months was brutal and highly public. The liquidation of Bennett Construction made headlines in all the regional financial papers. The company was stripped for parts, its assets sold off to pay the staggering debts. Callahan fought the eviction, but my legal team crushed him in court. He was forced to move into a tiny, rented apartment on the outskirts of the city, his reputation in the business world utterly annihilated. Blythe made good on her promise. She finalized the divorce rapidly, securing her European inheritance and cutting ties with her ruined husband. She moved to Tuscany, pretending she had never been associated with the disgraced construction mogul. The worst fate, however, fell on the golden child. The federal authorities did not take lightly to the embezzlement of union pension funds. Fallon was indicted on multiple counts of wire fraud. Without Callahan's millions to bribe judges or hire elite defense attorneys, she was left defenseless. Last I heard, she had accepted a plea deal guaranteeing her a minimum of 5 years in a federal correctional facility. As for me, I received a massive bonus from my firm for executing the most profitable distressed asset acquisition of the decade. I used a portion of it to quietly set up a trust fund for Nolan, the elderly security guard, ensuring his wife's medical bills would be covered for the rest of her life. I am sitting here now, holding a cup of hot coffee, looking out over the city skyline from the balcony of my penthouse. The lights below twinkle like distant stars. My life is quiet, peaceful, and entirely my own. I have not spoken to Callahan, Blythe, or Fallon since that night, and I never will again. I learned a lesson that is worth more than all the money in my portfolio. Respect cannot be inherited, it cannot be bought, and it certainly cannot be demanded by toxic people holding a title. Respect must be earned. And self-respect is the most valuable asset you will ever own. Occasionally, I get emails from distant relatives. Some of the flying monkeys still try to reach out, calling me cold, ruthless, and heartless. They say that family is family, no matter what. They say that destroying an old man and sending my sister to prison was going too far. They tell me I should have shown mercy, that I should have given them one last chance to do the right thing. I delete those emails without reading past the first few lines. But the question still lingers in the air, floating around the internet, debated by people who have never had to survive the kind of fire I walked through. So, I turn the question over to you. Was I wrong? Was I too cruel when I refused to save them? Did I cross a line by personally orchestrating the financial and legal destruction of my own flesh and blood, or did they simply reap exactly what they had spent a lifetime sowing? Thank you for staying with me until the very end of this journey. If you found satisfaction in seeing karma finally collect its debts, please hit that like button, share this video with anyone who needs a reminder to stand their ground, and subscribe to the channel so you never miss another story. Let me know your final verdict down in the comments below. I read every single one. Until next time, stay strong and never let anyone tell you that you are worthless.